Andrew Pessin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be back.
So, we were just talking before starting recording that I am teaching a modern Jewish thought class. And we're talking about the 19th century. So, really, the period Jews in Western Europe, a little bit in America. And we were both kind of talking about how the entire 19th century almost necessitates Zionism being the obvious solution to the problems that Jews were going in. For people that don't know much about the 19th century or the origins of political Zionist movement, I'm curious if you can give your elevator pitch for why the 1800s lead sort of to Zionism being the obvious end goal.
Sure. As I mentioned to you a few years ago, I developed a course I call Big Ideas of the 19th Century. And I developed it initially personally to understand better why it was that modern political Zionism arose when it did in 1896 at the end of the century with this guy, Theodor Herzl. And so I started studying the ideas of the 19th century. And it turns out the 19th century is a very interesting time. Most of the centuries actually are pretty interesting times. And when you start studying what I call the big ideas. And so what I mean by a big idea is an idea that really ends up changing the world in some large scale way. It's a little bit of a vague concept, but good enough. So, most of what we study in philosophy, I spent a bunch of years studying René Descartes' philosophy and his metaphysics. And those were important and interesting ideas, but they weren't big ideas. They didn't really change the world. The cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, just didn't change the world in the way that, for example, Marxism changes the world or Darwinism changes the world, just to cite two of the big ideas of the 19th century. So I started looking at these ideas, and you really have to begin have a little bit of a running head start. So you have to begin kind of wrapping up the 18th century, because the 18th century, of course, is associated with the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment really launches things. And the Enlightenment continues to develop into the 19th century, but almost immediately generates various forms of criticism and pushback. And so, Enlightenment, of course, gives us liberalism and emancipation. And suddenly the ideas that Jews might be equal citizens of these European countries they live in is on the table and very much being discussed throughout much of the 19th century. These ideas happen at different places, different ways, different times. But this is one of the big questions of the 19th century, whether to give Jews equal rights, does it make sense? Are Jews actually regular citizens, or are they different people altogether? These are things I know you're familiar with. So those are the conversations that are launching the 19th century, but partly in pushing back against these liberal assimilationist emancipation ideas, you start getting movements such as Romanticism and Nationalism. And nationalism, in its earliest forms, I like to call it, I might be going into too much detail here, but I like to call it good nationalism. In its earliest forms, nationalism is the idea that, a meaningful life is one that's really being part of a community, something larger than yourself. Nothing objectionable about that. And the best political structure should sort of be nation states. And that's sort of okay as well, recognizing, and this is why it's good nationalism, that different people, different cultures will have different values, different ideas, different ways of life, and they all should have their own nation state, and you should appreciate the diversity and pluralism of it all. That's sort of 19th century nationalism as it launches. But that's is a two-edged sword for the Jews, because if we're thinking we should have a nation state that is basically our ethnic group, well, now you have all these Jews who might be living amongst you, and are they really part of your ethnic group or not? And so nationalism is actually a very, I think, lovely idea when it launches in the 19th century, but it really heightens the problems. And then as the century goes along, you get into ideas such as, well, Marxism obviously is a key idea of the 19th century, and in particular, after Marxism, really right at the same time as Marxism, is Darwinism, which is underappreciated, I think, for its impact on the intellectual world. It's initially a theory about biology and evolution, but its social implications are just immediately apparent to people. So Darwinism gives us the idea, it really reinforces the idea that just as animals and plants divide into species, well, human beings divide into races, categories of things. And then Darwinism also gives the idea that life, the natural world, is, red in tooth and claw. It is this battle, of one creature, one species against another species, and starts giving you the idea that not only are there different races in the human world, but that these different races, first of all, might not be equal in any of the senses that we recognize today. There'll be important physical and intellectual and moral and emotional differences between the races. And you get the idea of the survival of the fittest being natural. as it is in nature, so to speak, but it gets applied to the social world. So suddenly you get the idea that science teaches us that peoples fall into these different races and they're not equal and they really can't mix and shouldn't mix. And that gives immediately rise to something called scientific racism. And that's the term they used at the time. Racism was a progressive position in the mid-late 19th century. It was science studying the different races, trying to understand what are the different traits of the races, what's better, what's worse, which races are better. This gets used to horrific ends. It ends up justifying slavery because darker races are inferior to lighter races and things like that. But it was seen as progressive and it was science, follow the science in the 19th century. And this, of course, immediately fuels anti-Semitism throughout much of Europe as well, but now understood to be scientifically based. The Jews are a different people from we French or we Germans, let's say, and they are inferior to us in all sorts of ways. And so we have the rise of political and racial anti-Semitism. So all these ideas are mixing together basically to make life nearly intolerable for many Jews in Europe in the 19th century. And that is the context in which Herzl arises and says, you know what, there's no future for Jews here. This set of ideas reaches the logical conclusion that we need to get rid of our Jews, basically. So let's get rid of ourselves and let's move off to Palestine and establish a Jewish state there. So when you study all that, first of all, it's just fascinating as an intellectual exercise. But more important, moreover, you watch the way ideas produce other ideas in these conversations, and you almost can see almost a logic, certainly a chronological and logical development of which Zionism is the natural conclusion. It just makes so much sense at the end of the 19th century. And when you study it, you realize not only was it sort of inevitable, this idea, by the end of the 19th century, but you've really developed an argument for it. You've justified it. You've shown, given the sequence of ways that people are thinking in the 19th century, only one response is justified and makes sense, and that would be Zionism. So Zionism is justified. It's a long argument for Zionism in the end. So that was a quick, I don't know, was it 10 minutes summary of a semester long course, but it's a lot of fun to study, and I
Perfect
guess
for people
gets
that
at the
have
contemporary issue.
ChatGPT or Instagram brain and can only follow for 10 minutes as opposed to a whole semester. It's
Yep.
we can just send it to your
That's
student.
right.
I'm totally kidding. No, it's also interesting just in this not that you presented a dichotomy, but oftentimes I think if you take your average, high school AP Euro class, it's presented where you had the Enlightenment slash liberals, and then you had the sort of, the people who didn't want liberalism and wanted to look back to this older era. But interestingly enough, both sides produce their own sort of version of anti-Semitism. Even the
Right.
pro-Enlightenment side. I mean, one of the things that I was telling you again offline that I think has stunned a lot of both Jewish and non-Jewish students in my modern Jewish thought class is even people like Immanuel Kant, seen as one of the, rightfully so, forefathers of the Enlightenment and this sort of paragon of excellent rationality and morality.
Right.
He wrote, things that today we would recognize as this is just anti-Semitic. I mean,
Right.
just for listeners, he thought that the Jewish allegiance to halacha or Jewish law made them unfit for emancipation because they would be their own state within a state. This is where this
Right.
idea starts to originate with people like Immanuel Kant, and then later on it's,
Right.
echoed by other thinkers, Bruno Bauer, and, Marx gives his own, sort of quasi-economic reading of this. But it wasn't as if you had, the Enlightenment slash liberal side all saying, nah, Jews should be equal and,
Right. Right.
full equality. And then the other people pushing back. Jews were sort of caught between two sides. I mean, you had people
Well,
that
but
didn't, yeah,
right, but that the version of anti-Semitism that comes there is famously summarized by the, Count Clermont-Tonnerre, and that right in the French National Assembly in the midst of the revolution, basically saying like, as individuals, we welcome you, assimilate, but as basically as a collective, but you have to give up your Jewish identity, and that's sort of what Kant is getting at as well, right? As long as you adhere to this archaic Jewish religion, which, unlike Christianity, has nothing to do with morality, says Kant, right? As long as you, today, what we would say is, as long as you stick to that Jewish identity, you can't fit here. The model we have of sort of universal harmony and morality is also a kind of homogeneity, right? You have to give up that unique identity. So that is a form of anti-Semitism. It's not quite the genocidal form, which is what's going to arise by the end of the 19th century, more of the right-wing anti-Semitism, where you're a different race, so it doesn't matter what practices or identity you have, we have to eliminate you. But it's still certainly from the perspective of today, we're so identity conscious in the 21st century. When we look at a Kant saying and a Clermont-Tonnerre in the French National Assembly saying, well, you could become citizens as long as you give up everything that's valuable and meaningful to you and sort of disavow your affinity to your people, that looks pretty horrific.
Yeah,
I think in that
or
day it was
maybe
seen as
it's
a
better
step
to call
forward.
it. Yeah, maybe it's better to call it anti-Jewish in the same way
Yeah,
that
yeah. I think that's
Jews could have received full equality in the 1300s and
becoming
northern
Christian.
Spain if they would become Christian. I mean, I think
Right.
the other interesting thing there, and just to give listeners, I guess to fill the 19th century just for listeners, and then we'll talk about the 21st century, which is why we actually plan this call. This is what happens when you get to philosophy and history nerds in a podcast here. But
Hey, call yourself a nerd.
there we go. I would say much of the Jewish denominational activity arose directly in response to Kant's criticism. In other words, the Reform movement, which
Right,
obviously was the first main denomination, essentially welcomed Kant's criticism and said, you're right. Not that we want to tell
right,
young
right,
Jews give up your Judaism, but we are going to tell young Jews make your Judaism look like German Protestant,
right.
behavior, just with some Jewish, symbols and a synagogue instead of a church and everything there.
Right.
I think one of the most underrated essays. I don't know why. I probably had read this in college, but I only came across it again, 2 years later. I sort of reread the famous Zionist reader, all these early Zionist thinkers right after October 7th. And Moshe Hess has, I think, one of
Yes.
the most
Oh,
powerful essays, Roman Jerusalem. He's writing this in the 1860s. So this is 30
that's
years
right.
before Herzl. And he essentially, after I read Moshe Hess, and I'm curious if this is your thinking as well, I realized, I mean, Herzl is probably as famous as he is because he was able to do the practical side and actually convene the Zionist Congress and get the word out.
Right,
But actually, in terms of ideas, it seems like Herzl did not have many original ideas. They were all found in Moshe
right,
Hess. And Hess has this one line that after you read it, it's incredible. And he says, no reform of the Jewish religion will lead to political equality because on the streets, the
it's the
Germans
nose.
hate Jewish noses much more than they
Yeah,
hate the peculiarities of Jewish law. And it's just
right,
such a interesting line, especially obviously knowing how the rest of the century and of course the 20th
right,
century
right.
unfolds.
Well, he's, in the 1860s, he's almost certainly aware of Darwin, and he's kind of a reformed Marxist, right? Or he's, at least not in the heart of the movement as he had previously been. And the idea of races was, prominent. Racism was a prominent idea, and he's recognizing that the form of anti-Semitism, which is now already dominant in his circles in Europe, is the racial anti-Semitism form, and there's nothing that can be done about that, as he says beautifully, right? I, um, the translation I have says something. It's not for the peculiarity of our laws, but the peculiarity of our noses, or something like that. It's a very powerful phrase, and there's nothing. Well, you can get a nose job, which some Jews do, right? But looking back in retrospect, I don't know, something to me seems very sad about those Jews who just, jumped up to take this little bone that the European majorities was tossing them. Like, just give up everything that makes you unique and join us. And I understand, I don't want to project contemporary ideas and feelings into that time. For many people, for many Jews, this was a wonderful opportunity and they welcomed it. But what was interesting, and even the case you mentioned of 14th century Jews could, in theory, convert and then escape some of the prejudices against them. They were never fully trusted, as generally speaking, right? That's why the Spanish Inquisition ended up being established because Jews were converting, but maybe secretly they were still being Jews. And that same suspicion reoccurs or continues to occur as you get into the 19th century as well. So even these Jews who were assimilating uh, were made suspicious by what became known as the racial anti-Semites. It doesn't matter if you convert to Christianity. It doesn't matter if you stop going to your synagogue or you get rid of the Hebrew and you're speaking German in your synagogue. None of that matters because you're still a Jew, right? And you can't get rid of the Jewishness. And in fact, in the same way that the Marranos, the undercover Jews of, the medieval Christianity, the ones who had converted but maintained a secret identity, um, were seen as the most problematic in the 19th century. This was like very much a trope that the Jews who converted to Christianity, or even just the Reformed Jews, but even the ones who converted to Christianity in the 19th century, which was a very easy thing to do if you wanted to fit in, they were actually the ones you had to most worry about because they were like undercover moles, right? They're still Jews because they're ethnically Jewish and you can't get rid of that, but they're pretending to be Christians. So now we're welcoming them into our universities and we're welcoming them into our governments and we're welcoming them into our businesses. And what are they ultimately doing? They are obviously, because they're still Jews, their fundamental alliances are with other Jews. They are an undercover network of spies that are ultimately going to take over Europe, which is a good segue to what I'm working on right now, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But I don't know if you want to go there just yet. So,
Yeah, no, I mean let's jump into it. The only thing that I wanted to flag is,
okay,
and I oftentimes have this tension within my thinking about anti-Semitism today, and maybe this will be a good leadway into protocols back 120 something years ago, is from one vantage point, because obviously even once we get to Herzl and even after Herzl, the vast majority of Jews were not Zionists,
right,
especially in Western Europe. Eastern Europe was probably a higher percentage. And
right,
then we can talk about protocols in a second. But on the one hand, I look at that and I say, are they crazy? Were they not paying attention? Blah, blah, blah.
right.
And then I look at what friends of mine in Israel are saying about
Us
diasporic
today,
American communities, or sorry, Jewish communities. And they're like, are they crazy? Are they not seeing the writing on the wall? So I'm not
right,
sure if I was, pop into
right,
somewhere in Germany in the year 1900. Am I
right,
thinking that Herzl's some, crazy person who's actually hurting the Jewish cause? Because
right,
one of the things that I
right.
just want to flag, and then I think we'll, hop over to the Eastern Europe and talk about protocols, is at some point, the Jewish anti-Zionists, and again, obviously to differentiate pre-state Jewish anti-Zionists with what we mean when we say anti-Zionist today,
Of
but the
course,
pre-state Jewish anti-Zionists, these are people who wanted what was best for the Jewish community. They wanted
right.
Jewish rights and equality. They, maybe rightfully so, viewed Zionism as actually hurting their case for Jews being seen
Sure.
as pure
Right,
Germans or pure French and getting equality, because
right.
essentially the anti Semites were saying Jews aren't really German, they're this other state.
And
The
then so
Jewish
were the
liberals
Zionists.
were
Right,
saying, no, we're not, we're German. And then the Zionists
right,
are saying, hey, we're Jews, we're another nation. And so there
right.
was a good faith argument there. It's obvious the Zionists, were correct because of the historic record. But
Right.
let's hop over to talk about protocols for a minute. How does that come into this equation?
So I don't know if I'm ready to hop over now because you said so many interesting things there, right? These are we have the benefit of hindsight, and this question for me usually arises when you look back like 1930s German Jews. Why the hell didn't they get out? Because um, and it applies again to this day. I think this is maybe it's a perennial Jewish question, I suppose, which is from a certain distance you can see a pattern or a trajectory, but when you're in the middle of it and living it, you either don't see it or you don't feel it as intently. And it's hard to imagine what it would feel like to be a 19th century German or French Jew. Let's say those are really the two ground zeros for this conversation. When you read Herzl, and I actually often do a unit on my class when we do the anti-Semitism unit in the 19th century class. We read a whole bunch of major text from the 19th century and just the open, overt, Richard Wagner, for example, complaining about the Jewification of music, right? Like it's just such open, overt racism, anti-Semitism, etc. And then, or Drumont in France, and or Fritsch in Germany, and others. What you see when you look at these texts is, first of all, open, overt, published, but then it turns out each one of these texts, or just about all of them, were like major bestsellers. Like this Drumont text, which was like 1,000 pages long in France. It was called Jewish France or something. He was claiming that the Jews had basically taken over France and were controlling France at a time when the Jews were something like 1% of the population of France, right? So like the level of delusion is just absolutely stunning. This book was something like 1,000 pages, and in the course of 10 or 15 years, it went through something like 20 editions, meaning they kept selling out the print run and printing more. It's basically the equivalent of being like, New York Times #1 bestseller for 10 years, this 1,000-page book that is just open anti-Semitism. So what is it like to be a French Jewish person living in Paris at this time? I, I don't know enough. I'm not a social scientist, etc. But like in retrospect, we see, well, it is clearly obvious, and this is what hurts us all. Like, there's no future for you here. Maybe they're not murdering you today or tomorrow, but like, we see where that's going. But on the other hand, I don't know. What if you don't read Drumont's book and none of your immediate acquaintances have read Drumont's book? So what that other people are reading it? They're not acting on it, right? It's just crazy beliefs. So it's very easy. I want to be sympathetic towards these people who didn't see the writing on the wall because in retrospect, it's unavoidable and ineluctable, to use a fancy word. But when you're living it, you don't know what the future is going to bring. And even, with Hitler, for a good number of years into the Nazi regime, many of the Jews were saying, all right, he's a passing trend, right? He's in power now, like they say of Mamdani, right? We can handle 4 years of that, not to compare Mamdani with Hitler exactly, but we can handle 4 years of that. Or okay, but he'll be overthrown, whatever. He'll moderate. It's easy to tell yourself those things, and only in retrospect does it become clear that one is wrong. So I have sympathy for those people. But now to come back to the current day, you know, what helps me have sympathy is I think I feel I and many of us are in the same position right now. As you've said, Israelis are looking at us, and I do worry. I use this line in some of my writings, like, what are future Jews going to say when they look back at the United States of the 2020s? Like, why didn't they get out? What were they thinking? Right? Like, and I happen to think I'm a kind of pessimistic person. I think things are really bad. I think they're really dangerous and dark and existential. So I'm on the sort of extreme end of that spectrum. But I'm not packing up and moving. Like, so does that mean I don't really believe that? Or is it two things? One, packing up and moving is such an enormous like thing to have to deal with. And I don't feel like there's an immediate threat, like someone's going to come shoot up my house or a mob is going to come after my house in the immediate future. So it's easy to think, well, we'll just fight against it. This is what I do, right? I'm very bit, and you do, right? Like I'm gonna speak and I'm gonna write and I'm gonna start an institute that we'll talk about in a few minutes. I'm gonna fight against it and we'll fix it or we'll mitigate it or we'll solve it or something like that. I could turn out to be fatally wrong, as the 1930s Germans Jews turned out to be, and many European Jews in general turned out to be. But while you're in the middle of it, it's not so obvious that it has to go that terrible way. And yeah, so we shouldn't condemn or critique those folks too vigorously, especially since
Totally
we
agree.
have them in
I,
their
I
shoes
know
right
that
now.
if I respond and we stay in this category, we're
That's
never
where
going
we'll
to get
go.
to what we actually want to talk about. So I would love to hear a little bit about Protocols of Elders of Zion. One,
Okay.
for people that have never heard about it, where does this text come from? What does it allege? And then how does it reverberate, till even now on campus?
Sure. So that's enormous. So I'll start with a little piece of that, and we'll see
In
where
in
that goes.
2 minutes or less. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, talk really, really fast. So the reason I mentioned that text a few minutes ago sort of came out of the blue as we were talking about the 19th century, as this idea of racial anti-Semitism is really taking hold in Europe. Jews are a different race, and again, it's fueled partly by Darwinism, etc. You get the sense, and I mentioned that Drumont book, that a few things are happening in the 19th century. First, emancipation is more or less happening. Some form of liberalism is happening. So Jews are going to universities. They are moving into professions that previously they'd been restricted from, like business and the law and teaching at the universities, amongst things. Jews have long been in the financial industry for reasons not medieval reasons. We don't have to go into those now, but Jews with their incredible tradition of study and learning and education and literacy, etc. It's not a surprise, I would say, that when Jews are permitted to join ordinary civilian society in Europe, they succeed on average, right? On average, they succeed. They become successful at what they do. They become prominent. They become prominent in culture. They become prominent in business. They become prominent in law. They become prominent in academia, etc. So that's one thing that's happening. Jews are becoming prominent. Meanwhile, you have the racial anti-Semites who see Jews as foreigners, and it doesn't matter that this particular Jew's family might have been in Germany for 10 centuries or something like that, or certainly many, many generations. As long as you believe in this form of racism, they can never be the same as a natural German. They're always a foreign people. So what they start to see in their eyes is that Jews are taking over. Jews are taking over. And that feeds this fantasy, and lots of psychological analysis one could do of what makes one susceptible to this thinking. But the way it works is if you are prone to this sort of conspiratorial thinking, you only need one little data point here or there to tie together your whole theory. It doesn't matter that Jews were never more than 2% of the German population. What you notice is 10% of the lawyers are Jewish or something like that, right? Disproportionate representation, as the kids say today, right? That's enough for you to think Jews are controlling things, even though a rational person knows it's mathematically impossible for 2% of the population to control anything. They might be disproportionately represented in a few prominent fields, but that means they are disproportionately underrepresented in a whole bunch of other fields because just mathematically, right? But if you're prone this way, you'll notice a few successful Jewish bankers or Jewish lawyers, and that will feed into this theory that the Jews are taking over your world. And so um, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is certainly the most important and the most influential anti-Semitic text ever composed. I actually am willing to argue it's the most influential book, period, of the 20th century. We can have that argument a little bit later if you like. It appears in 1903 is the usually accepted earliest date. It has a bunch of precedents prior to that, but the book we know today as Protocols of the Elders of Zion appears in Russia in about 1903, and it purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting that the elders of Zion, i.e., the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, had behind the scenes of the first Zionist Congress in 1897, speaking of Herzl, right? So Herzl's book was 1896, The Jewish State. Within a year, he manages to hold this conference in Switzerland, the first Zionist Congress. So there's a factoid or a kernel of truth that they can sort of pin this thing onto. So the claim is now there was a secret meeting behind the scenes of this. And in this secret meeting, the elders spelled out their plans to basically take over the world, conquer and subjugate all the non-Jews, all the Gentiles of the world, and it spelled out their protocols, namely the procedures they were going to follow in order to bring about this plan, and that these are now all very familiar modern anti-Semitic tropes. They would control the banks. They would start wars. They would pull the strings of politicians. This book was very much against liberalism. So the Jews were responsible for liberalism, which is a way of introducing disorder into traditional societies. Of course, that Jews very quickly became that Jews are communists, etc. So they introduced communism as a revolution to take over the world. So all these tropes that Jews are pulling the strings of things ultimately to advance their own power. That's what's in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in the same way that sort of Zionism makes sense as the culmination of the sequence of ideas of the 19th century, I think you could also see as a kind of pushback, a counter movement, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion also makes sense from the perspective of those people who were certainly prone to hatred, prone to anti-Semitism when they see their world changing in the 19th century, and specifically the way I just mentioned with this emancipation and the Jews becoming successful. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is almost a natural thing to think of if you're that sort of person. So it's ground zero for what is now sometimes referred to as conspiratorial anti-Semitism. And the reason it's important to mention that for many of the long, long, long centuries of Christian anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, if you prefer, right? Jews were often, and it was actually intentional and deliberate, thanks to this guy named Augustine in the fourth century, but Jews were seen as problems, as evil, but as in fundamentally inferior. Jews were, you had to be careful about them because they were in fact evil and they were committed to all sorts of evil pursuits, but they were fundamentally inferior. They had once been chosen, but they'd lost the covenant, and they were in a permanent state of, God destroyed their temple and kept them in exile, and they're in a permanent state of degradation for many, many long centuries. And of course, the irony is that it's the Christian societies that kept them in a state of degradation and then pointed at the state of degradation and say, see, you're not favored by God. It's a very nice little trick that they did there. But empirically, they were construed as inferior. What happens in the 19th century through this sequence of ideas that we just went through is by the end of the 19th century, instead of seeing Jews as inferior, they're still evil. Suddenly, it's a fear that Jews are actually superior. They're all powerful. They control everything. They are actually a threat to Germany, to Europe, to the world, etc. It's actually a major reversal in the anti-Semitism from the weak, inferior, degraded Jews to the fear of the all-powerful, mighty Jews. It's the same hatred, right? It's still hatred of Jews, but it changes form through really just in the course of this century. And that's all encapsulated in this book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So from this point onwards, the 20th century, the major, impactful, influential forms of anti-Semitism are all downstream from the protocols. It's the Jews pulling strings, controlling things to advance their own power over the Gentiles. So
It's
that's
also worth noting that in protocols is a Eastern Europe, imperialist Russia
right.
product, and this is not a place where Jews had experienced emancipation and had equality. Not saying it would have been reasonable if it was coming from France or
That's
Germany,
right.
but at least in France or Germany, Jews did wield social, professional, and
Right.
political power, and places in England there were Jews in the banking system and everything. To
Right.
the best of my knowledge, there was almost no Jews who had any power, be it economic, social, political, or professional power of anything
Right.
in Russia in 1903. And it's also worth flagging that Russia had its own sort of virulent type of anti-Semitism. I mean, I don't remember if the
Absolutely.
Kishinev pogrom came right before protocols or after, but Kishinev pogrom was just one of the most beautiful,
1903. Right.
brutal pogroms. I think it was also 1902 or 1903,
It
and
was
so
1903. Yeah.
yeah, so it's almost like the protocols was post hoc rationalization of trying to explain the anti-Semitism that was already on the ground. Okay, so how does this all correlate and eventually get into very much what people like yourself are working on now, 100 and something years later? Obviously there's some gaps in the timeline that
Right.
I want to flag, but
Yeah, so let me just mention a couple of highlights in that timeline, and there's lots more to fill in. And this is work I'm doing now, so I'm educating myself as we speak on these issues because this is really my new project for the foreseeable future. So you've got the protocols coming out, conspiratorial anti-Semitism, and I'm tempted to respond to the interesting things you just said, but let's move forward. I'll resist that. Um, uh, uh, the protocols has a very interesting journey, this text. So I suggested it's the most influential book of the 20th century, certainly the most influential anti-Semitic book. The protocols sort of spread like wildfire. They are taken from Russia to Europe by basically like some of the white Russians who are leaving. Russia goes into the Civil War, right? The Communist Revolution is happening 1917 to 1920 or so. And the white army is the ones that are resisting it, but they end up losing. So Russia turns communist at that point. It's these white Russians who basically escape into Europe, in particular where it matters most to Germany. And so they bring the protocols with them to Germany and immediately start translating it into German and spreading it. And so the protocol spreads like wildfire in the 1920s in Germany. This is before Hitler's rise to power. He's just sort of entering, at the earliest stages of his political career in the early 1920s. Germany is afire with the protocols, and the protocols is particularly appealing to Germans of this period because they've just lost World War One, and they feel that they should have won World War One, and that they were badly betrayed. And so you've got a convenient scapegoat. It was the Jews who started World War One as part of a campaign to destroy Germany. So you had this sort of fertile, and there's already a long history of anti-Semitism in place, right? So you add the protocols to the long history of German anti-Semitism, and the Nazis suddenly make a lot of sense, right? It just fits that this is where the Germans are going. Uh, Hitler and the major Nazis not only were familiar with the protocols, but Goebbels said that Hitler had it on his bedside table and had memorized it, right? And according to Hannah Arendt, a great 20th century intellectual and scholar of tyranny, right, of totalitarianism, she said that Hitler gets two major things out of the Protocols for the Elder of Zion. First of all, learning that, and he's already susceptible to believing it. Because by the way, let's stress, it's all delusional nonsense, right? There are no elders. There was no such meeting. The Jews do not have this plan, right? It's delusional nonsense, and rational people understand that. But putting that aside, if you're already prone to believe in the protocols, then you become very afraid that the Jews are undertaking this plot to take over the world, and that includes destroying Germany. And so naturally, out of what you would call self-defense, you have to go fight the Jews. You need to annihilate this threat. So the first thing he gets out of the protocols is that we need to activate Germany against the Jews today the kids say resistance, right? Self-defense. The Jews are the aggressors, and Germany has to defend itself against the Jews. And then the second idea that he gets from the protocols, according to Hannah Arendt, is, hey, this idea of taking over the world and subjugating all the peoples of the world, that's a pretty good idea. So she argues that, in fact, this whole Nazi Aryan campaign to basically Lebensraum and take over the world, he gets out of the protocols. And so there really is a straight line from the protocols to the Holocaust, ultimately. If this is what you believe about the world, what the protocols tells you, then the only solution is going to be to literally eliminate the Jews. Right. And they are also, it's not like the Jews are all located in one little country, and this will be our segue to Zionism in a second. They're not located in one little place. They're spread out all over the world. So, even if you defeat a few of them here, they can regroup. What you really need to do to fight this threat of the protocols is literally to annihilate the whole people. And so there's a straight line from the protocols through Hitler's bedside table to the Holocaust, quite literally. So talk about an influential book, right? Um,
I've
but
I've
now,
heard I didn't have enough time to really fact check this. And so I haven't talked about it on the podcast before, but so I want to bounce this off of you. I've read this. I don't know if it's true that apparently, according to at least, this one set of thinking, Hitler's original plan was not to kill the Jews. It was essentially to kick the Jews out of Germany. And it wasn't until he meets with Al Husseini, who's the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who's, one of the heads of, the
right,
Palestinian,
the Mufti, right.
anti-Zionist movement at the time, who essentially he obviously doesn't want Germany to kick out the Jews because that means more Jewish immigration to British Mandate Palestine.
Right.
So he's the one who puts in Hitler's head, hey, you should kill them. I have no idea if there's any truth to that, but I have heard that.
Right. I've heard that too. I'm currently sort of researching in that area. I'm very interested in the straight line from the Nazis to the Muslim Arab world. And there were not just one straight line. There were many, many connections, many tendrils connecting the two. And so I've heard that as well. Certainly if you just look empirically in the early years of the Nazi regime, they didn't just launch into annihilating the Jews, right? The earliest formulation of the Nazi scheme was to remove the Jews, and that's why you get things like the transfer agreement, the Havara, the relationship with the early Zionists, which is often misconstrued by the haters today. But in the 1930s, the Zionists and the Nazis did share an aim, which is to remove the Jews from Germany. That was the Nazi part of it, and get them to Palestine was the Zionist part of it, right? And so they collaborated isn't a very good word for it, but that's the word the haters use today because they want to pretend that Zionists are Nazis. They collaborated with Nazis. So I don't think that's the best word, but the early years of the Nazi regime were about that for sure. And I know scholars debate when exactly was the decision made to kill them. There's discussion about that. What role did the Mufti, who you just mentioned, play in those decisions? Without question, the Mufti did a number of things. There were very specific episodes, such as, I forget exactly which country the Nazis had conquered. I almost want to say Romania, but that might not be correct. There were like hundreds of Jewish orphans that were going to be shipped out to Palestine because the Nazis had no use for them. And the Mufti put up a whole protest against that, and he refused to allow those Jewish orphans from that conquered country to emigrate, and they ended up, of course, dying in the Holocaust. So there's a number of specific incidents where the Mufti has direct responsibility for, leading to the death of Jews. And in general, he certainly campaigned against allowing Jews to emigrate into Palestine. So many Jews were stuck in Europe because the one possible escape route, Palestine, was closed to them by the Mufti and by the Mufti's campaigning. But whether the Mufti put the little idea in Hitler's head of why don't you, build concentration camps, etc., that's unclear. The Mufti visited concentration camps. He was fully aware of what was going on, and he did use language such as basically bringing the final solution to the Middle East. He was, working for the Nazi cause so that the Nazis could continue the final solution elsewhere. But at least logically, the logical conclusion of the protocols would be you have to annihilate the threat, and that's part of what motivates the Nazis. Now we get to Zionism. We just mentioned connection there, the
One
early
second, before we go to
Zionists.
Zionism,
Yeah.
can we do
Okay.
one more segue here
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
you had mentioned you're currently looking into anti-Semitism's directionality into the Islamic world. I'm curious if you
Right.
can just talk about that for a minute.
So, um, a minute. how fast can I?
A
Um,
Jewish minute, it can be.
you mean an hour? So, it's a fascinating question because my main focus today, and we will get to that because that was the reason we're having this call, was to talk. I've launched the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. I want to study anti-Zionism through a critical lens, or from through a critical perspective. And to do that means you become aware of the different major sources or directions of anti-Zionism. And, the big few are, of course, the Nazis, the Soviets, the Muslim Arabs, and the Western progressives. There are many others as well, but those are the big four. And we could throw in Jewish anti-Zionists, but they sort of are they're whole different things. So let's bracket them for now. So those are the four main sources, and I want to understand first of all anti-Zionism as it develops in each of those domains, but also more importantly, for my particular interests, I want to understand the links between those different domains because I argued in a long paper I published on my Substack, and I'm going to continue in this project I'm working on. I think it's actually useful to think of anti-Zionism, ironically, as a global conspiracy against the Jews. And I say ironically because the big central text of anti-Semitism is the Protocols, which suggests that the Jews are engaging in a global conspiracy against the world. But in fact, that's delusional nonsense. And what it does is it covers up for the fact, in my view, that there actually does exist a genuine conspiracy in the opposite direction. It's if not the entire globe, then certainly significant proportions thereof are engaged in a global conspiracy against the Jews. So to see that, I'm looking at the Nazis, the Soviets, the Muslim Arabs, and the Western progressives, but especially the linkings between them. So when I mentioned that line, there are so many connections between the Nazis and the Muslim Arabs. It's actually frightening. It is not entirely unfair, in my view. It's not fully complete or accurate, but it's not unfair to say that the Muslim Arab campaign against Zionism was just the extension of the Nazi program into the Middle East. And the reason it's important to say something like that, if you can argue for it and defend it, is as follows. A lot of people, especially the Western progressives, Israel and the Jews are guilty of some fundamental sins. They didn't belong in Palestine. They came in, they took over Palestine, they kicked out the locals, etc. So of course the Muslim Arabs are upset. They have legitimate grievances against the Israel. But when you understand this other way of looking at it that I just mentioned, and you see the Muslim Arab campaign as an extension of the Nazi campaign, then rhetorically that's actually quite powerful because even today's progressive haters of Israel, they're willing to agree the Nazis are evil. That's anti-Semitism. We're against that. Hitler's, a very evil man. They say that too. But what they want to do is distinguish the Nazi campaign against the Jews from the Muslim Arab campaign against the Jews. The Nazis are evil, but the Muslim and Arabs, that's legitimate. They've got real grievances, etc. But when you see, if you can argue convincingly enough that the Muslim Arab campaign is just an extension of the Nazi campaign, then that's a powerful response to that perspective, which is a very dominant one in the progressive left and certainly on campuses today. So that's what's behind this project. And so there are many connections. The Mufti, as you mentioned, is always exhibit number one. Everyone knows about the Mufti, and that should actually be enough to make the point, frankly, right? Without going into more detail now. But there were a good number, for example, of other Nazis who, after the war, moved into the Arab world and just continued the campaign from there, including a famous one, Johann von Leers is a famous one. He ended up converting to Islam and working in Cairo, and I think he was running propaganda from Cairo. He's literally a Nazi now in Cairo, helping to fuel the Muslim propaganda against the Jews. So there's those sorts of links, and then of course there's very important links from the Soviets to the Muslim Arabs as well. So I think that answered the question. Was that
Yes, yes, it did.
okay?
In terms of okay, let's now
In a
finally
Jewish
get to
minute. Okay.
2026 Critical Institute for Study of Anti-Zionism. Can you just, I mean, you touched on it a couple different times, but can you briefly summarize the project and exactly what you are
Well,
studying?
before I do that, I want to link it to the whole conversation we've had, which was not one big long digression, but in fact the foundation for this, which is the following. When you understand, so Zionism as a modern political movement begins 1896, and flutters around for a while before finally gaining steam and finally achieving fruition in 1948 with the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. There's all sorts of opposition to anti-Zionism at the time. We mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, I don't recall if we were already recording at that point, but might have been before, but we were talking about, early Jewish forms of anti-Zionism, which are very different from the anti-Zionism that I care about today. But anti-Zionism as a significant movement, certainly the Nazis are a major initial source of that. And the reason I want to stress that is as follows. When you understand the role of the protocols, and they were spreading like wildfire in the 1920s in Germany, remember, before Hitler, but then certainly Hitler takes them and operationalizes them to produce the Holocaust. That's how powerful they are to Hitler. If you start from the place that the Jews are evil, right? The Jews are evil, and then throw into it this idea that the Jews have this conspiracy to take over the globe and subjugate all the non-Jews, right? How are you going to see Zionism, right? You are going to see Zionism as a dangerous, terrible, horrible thing because Zionism is just going to be the instrument or the Jewish state is going to be the instrument the Jews will use to advance their conspiracy against the globe. So what I want to make very, very clear is if you start off from this place of deep, deep anti-Semitism, Jewish hatred, and especially influenced by the protocols, conspiratorial anti-Semitism, there's no possible way you can be a Zionist as a result of that. You will be an anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionism flows instantly, directly, and immediately from this conspiratorial anti-Semitism. That is absolutely the case with the Nazi Germans. There's a whole bunch of texts I could quote from Hitler and others saying exactly what I just said.
There's
Right.
one thing that I wanted to ask that I think I agree with you. But in terms of the subjectivity of all of this, in terms of you actually talk to anti-Zionist slash anti-Semites, the one
Right.
interesting difference might be both the Enlightenment anti-Semites, such as Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, and then people like Wagner, and then later on the racial scientists, and then later on the protocols, and then of course the Nazis. They held up their anti-Semitism as a enlightened value of goodness, and they were proud of it, and they would,
Right.
if you said you're being anti-Semitic, they would say, why, thank you, and I'm so glad you
Right.
noticed.
Exactly. Right.
And today the anti-Zionists, who are, again, I agree, perpetuating this exact same anti-Semitism, just in, albeit in a little bit of a different
Right. Right. Right.
form, they are aghast when you accuse that they might be doing something anti-Semitic. And I
Right.
wonder, is that just because, at least in the West, post-Holocaust, anti-Semitism has become such a dirty word that they had to sort of reinvent, no, we're not anti-Semitic, we are
Right.
anti-Zionist, right? They sort of invent almost a new term. Or,
Right.
is that just because the mores of the time have changed? Because, again, in the Muslim world, right, in terms of what they're actually saying in Arabic, right, they're back to the proudly anti-Semitic, right? Like they will say, Hamas does not hide their anti-Semitism. Hamas
That's
and
right.
Iran does not hide their anti-Semitism. They are proudly anti-Semitic. But then when you
Right.
talk to, Miss blue-haired, English studies professor at, a university, she is, well, of course I'm not anti-Semitic. In fact, maybe, her best friend is Jewish, maybe she's Jewish, right? So that is an interesting difference that I think is tough to
Yeah.
tackle.
Oh, so many things to say all at once. Where does one begin? But I mean, you're absolutely right. But let me take a while to get there. Maybe we won't get there. We'll see. So what I want to begin by showing is how in its origins, anti-Zionism is deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, right? And I already mentioned how when people, certainly Westerners, look at the Muslim Arabs, they somehow ignore the anti-Semitic component and just see the anti-Zionist component and believe that it's based on legitimate grievances. And by the way, if you believe, for example, that a certain set of people had come into your country and kicked you out and taken over, of course you're not going to like those people. That makes a lot of sense. But what is missing in that picture, and I do think, although today's Western progressives, they're not identifying themselves, certainly not with the Nazis and not even with the original Muslim Arabs, but they're identifying themselves with contemporary Muslim Arab campaign, right? What they are refusing to see is the degree to which, let's say, the original Muslim Arab campaign was infused with the Nazi and also the Soviet anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, right? So they are sort of ignoring the fact that the movement that they're endorsing today has deep roots in and direct lines into something that even if they were being fair about it, they would recognize as anti-Semitism, the thing they want to claim that they don't hold, right? So in order to make the distinction that they're making, we're just anti-Zionist, but we abhor Semitism, they literally have to ignore the actual history of their movement, which is just deeply rooted in this conspiratorial Jew hatred. As we get into the Muslim Arab world, it's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, there's this incredibly long history, and this is also something that the progressive movement cannot tolerate. Incredibly long history of Islamic anti-Semitism, straightforward anti-Semitism. Look at the Muslim Brotherhood just in the 20th century, like that stream of Islamism, if we want to distinguish Islamism from Islam in general, right? Islamism is represented by the Muslim Brotherhood is just openly, blatantly, and as you said, proudly, like, of course we're anti-Semites. The Jews are the source of all the evil in the world. Why wouldn't we be opposed to them, right? So there's we a long history of that in the Muslim Arab world. What happens with the Nazis is the Nazis, by the way, they disseminated Arabic translations of the protocols into the Arab world, right? So they introduce this text into a world that's already filled with this long history of Jew hatred from Islam, as I mentioned a moment ago. And so you've got this, it's fuel on the fire, maybe would be the good metaphor there, right? There's already simmering Jew hatred. Now you throw in this conspiratorial claim that the Jews are going to take over the world, and they see it happening in real time in front of their eyes in the 1930s and 40s and 50s as Israel is being established. So this is how they're going to interpret the establishment of Israel. By the way, we know our narrative, right? Our narrative is that the establishment of Israel, it's the national liberation movement. Jews were refugees fleeing pogroms and the Holocaust and just looking for a safe haven, returning to their ancestral homeland. There's something very beautiful and wonderful and pure about that description, right? What they see are these evil Jews who've been trying to destroy Islam since the beginning of Islam, who now have a plan to take over the entire world and build a state to advance that plan. That's what they see in Israel, right? Throw on top of that, okay, some legitimate grievances, right? Things wasn't all smooth and roses, right? There were legitimate things that we could understand them to not like about Zionism. But what the important thing to recognize is Zionism or the anti-Zionism there is not even remotely objectively fair or accurate or true. It's they're seeing the establishment of Israel through this lens of such profound Jew hatred that the anti-Zionism cannot be distinguished from that Jew hatred. That's why they're anti-Zionists, because they see this thing through the lens of this deep Jew hatred fueled by the Nazis, right? Today's Western progressives, they just don't see any of that, right? They just imagine it's all legitimate grievances, and we can come to those in a moment. Then the Soviets, and running out of steam, and I know we're going on long, so I won't talk about the Soviets, but there's a massive, I know you've talked to Isabella Tabarovsky and you've talked to Adam Lewis Klein, so your viewers will have seen that. Like, you cannot overstate the vicious anti-Semitism of the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign, a government-sponsored, decades-long campaign to destroy the Jewish state. And by the way, one of the main influences of that campaign are the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, remember, appeared in Russia. Russia was ground zero for this, and they continued to maintain their influence throughout the 1970s, the 1980s, etc. So the protocols is present with the Nazis and running the show, I'll say. The protocol is present and immensely influential in the Arab world. The protocols is present and practically running the show in the Soviet Union, right? And so when you look at the history of anti-Zionism, and we're not even up to the Western progressives yet, right? Like, the history of anti-Zionism is the manifestation of this protocol's ideology. And it is exactly what Hitler said he needed to do. The Jews are trying to conquer the world and conquer us, so we have to conquer the Jews and annihilate them. That's what anti-Zionism is. You cannot, once you see the role of the protocols in this, you cannot see anti-Zionism, and certainly historically, except as the manifestation of a response to the protocols. And when you're doing that, by the way, you're doing what Hitler did. You are thinking as Hitler thought, right? You're reading this book, you're taking it seriously. You have to defend yourself against the Jews, who are extremely evil, obviously, in this picture. And you're just like Hitler, right?
The progressive piece, I mean, I know you mentioned we didn't
Okay.
even get into the progressive yet. I mean, just in terms of my read, and then I do have one more, general
Right.
big question for you before we finish for today. Um, it seems like it got into the progressive world just through two different streams. One
Right.
is general Soviet sort of anti-Western,
Right.
anti-imperialist influence of just borrowing a lot of language from,
Right.
Soviet Union about everything from, even criticizing, how dare America try to take out Maduro, type thing. Obviously with the
Right.
Zionism, it's worse just because Jews get implicated and it's a lot, hotter of an issue than even Venezuela. And then the other one is just the massive amounts of money that Arab countries are spending trying to blast social media to, good, upstanding liberals in the West's, TikTok feed of saying, Israel really is committing, the worst human rights abuses in the
Right.
history of the world to the point where if you're a 18-year-old who doesn't really know better, you are going to think that, the great
Right.
justice cause of our time is protesting against the war in Gaza.
Right. So lots to say there. So you've had Isabella Tabarovsky. So she's the best person to actually spell out the links. She's done this very clearly and beautifully to spell out the links between the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign and basically the global left, right? The global progressives who saw the Soviet Union as their mothership and guiding star. And the Soviet Union sponsored like endless international conferences where they'd fly in like all the leaders of the European left-wing movements, etc., and shower them with the wealth of their propaganda, right? And so there is absolutely a straight line from the Soviet Union to the Western progressive left. To that, if we had a little more time, maybe you've had these conversations with others, but when we look at what we're calling progressivism today, arising to some degree independently, maybe I have to think a little more about that. But if you look at from the 1960s onwards, just in America, let's focus there for a minute. The rise of critical race theory and post-colonial studies. Those are the two major ones, which give rise to a whole bunch of other things downstream from them, such as gender studies, gender and women's studies, etc. We should spend some time looking at that ideology. I want to be very brief there. So, on the one hand, it's very influenced by Marxist communism, right? The egalitarianism of Marxism and Marxism's fundamental binary of oppressor and oppressed, which for Marx, it was economic oppression. So, it was bourgeois and proletariat. But that binary remains has a powerful grip on the mentality of the left. And as we get into the 1960s in the West, in America in particular, it's now white versus black is the major binary of oppressor and oppressed. And then it's very, at the same time, man versus woman, right? And then it's going to be heterosexuals versus homosexuals, et cetera, right? So these binary oppressor-oppressed relations is straight out of Soviet Marxist communism, Leninist communism, et cetera. So it's those ideas are still present, but now they're focusing in the West, on race, etc. And when you look at that ideology, and we don't have time to go into it more deeply now, but when you look at that ideology, you're probably familiar with the picture that eventually arises by the time we get into the 1990s or 2000s. And certainly by the 2010s, and I would want to say the George Floyd incident with COVID in 2020, it was already a burning fire, but that's dropping the nuclear fuel and it was already a burning fire, right? At that point, the picture that emerges is that Western societies, with their capitalism and their white patriarchy, supremacist, all these are familiar slogans, I'm sure, to your listeners. Um, you have white supremacy is the fundamental problem of the West. That's the oppressor versus so whites oppressing people of color. And roughly speaking, economic success is a measure of where you stand on the hierarchy. So more successful you are on average, the more of an oppressor you are in this ideology. If you start off with this sort of zero-sum game of egalitarianism, a classless society, Marxism, then if it's zero-sum, then if anybody, let's say everyone has one coconut, but then if someone gets two coconuts, it must only be by taking it away from someone else, right? And so anyone who's successful is actually taking it away from the people who aren't successful. And the more successful you are, the more oppressor of an oppressor you are taking away from others. And of course, on average, the whites are suppressing people of color. But now here's the trick. Ultimately, in this ideology, because they're focusing on the West, they look at the Jew and they see two things. They see the Jews look mostly white on the surface of their skin in America, let's say. And two, on average, and I stress on average, Jews are more successful than many other minority groups. And again, only on average. There's loads of Jews who are not successful, and there's loads of non-Jews who are very successful. Nevertheless, on average, Jews are quote unquote disproportionately represented. Remember our discussion of 19th century anti-Semitism. Jews are maybe only 2 or 3% of the American population, but they might be, I don't know, 15% of the lawyers at a certain point. And at one point, they were 10% of Congress, which is pretty impressive for 2% of the population. But on the other hand, you're still only 1/10 of the senators or something like that, right? So the point is, in this progressive worldview fueled by critical race theory, we didn't really talk about post-colonial studies, but it's in there as well. Jews are seen as not only white supremacist oppressors, but because on average they're better off than many other minority groups, they're sometimes called, you've seen this phrase, uber white or hyper white,
Mhm.
meaning they are the worst of the oppressors, right? And on this picture, anyone who's successful is only successful by exerting power on and suppressing marginalized people. Jews are at the top of that hierarchy in the progressive worldview. And if you're paying attention, what does that sound like? It sounds like the protocols of the elders of Zion. Jews are conspiring to control the world, to advance their own power and marginalize all other peoples. So it turns out, I would argue, today's Western progressives, these wonderful blue-haired, nose pierced students and professors on our campuses who say, I'm not anti-Semitic. Oh, that's gross. Hitler was the most evil guy ever. I happen to think of Jews as sort of white supremacist oppressors of all marginalized people. I actually think the same thing as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, now expressed in very, modern progressive language, but it's literally the same conspiracy theory. And so throw in post-colonial studies, look at the Middle East, and what are they going to see? They're not going to see in Zionism, a beleaguered minority fighting against genocidal enemies for the last 100 years over there. They are going to see white supremacist oppressors marginalizing or oppressing people of color who they've decided the Palestinians are, which is also very bizarre and counterfactual, etc. So they're going to look at the Middle East through that lens. It turns out what they are doing, although they'll deny Hitler's anti-Semitism, they are thinking just like Hitler thought, right? So I want this message to get out. People need to see this. And so to this end, I have launched the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism because most people really have no idea about the actual origins of anti-Zionism, the way it evolved over the 20th century, the role that the protocols of the Elders of Zion play in it, and how all of that produces the contemporary manifestation of anti-Zionism, which allows them to say, as you put it so eloquently a little bit earlier, first of all, we reject anti-Semitism, and second of all, anti-Zionism is the morally pure position. Because when you finally unpack all of that, anti-Zionism, even as it's expressed by these progressives who disavow Hitler and anti-Semitism, is just the 21st manifestation of Hitlerism.
So obviously, in response to this, I think we both agree all Jews should be Zionists. I think that's sort of the one obvious thing to flag. The second, which I think is a more difficult question that I've been pondering lately, is Jews in the West in the last 200 years have typically, in the diaspora, so I'm talking about, people like us who, at least it seems like we're planning on spending the next several years, maybe the rest of our lives in America, have fought for, capital L liberalism and individualism and
Right.
things like that, because that very much is a worldview that's not too far left, not too far right, won't view us as part of a collective body politic of Jews, but will view us as individuals. The
Right.
other way that if we talk about both pre-Enlightenment or Jews in the Islamic world, right? Let's take Persian Jews before the revolution, right? During
Right.
the period of the Shah, attempted to fight for political protection is what the historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi calls the vertical alliance of Jewish protection. Essentially, just to define that for listeners, it's to say Jews, say random places in the 1600s or even in Iran in the, 1950s, 1960s, Jews were not trying to radically change society and to usher in some liberal revolution where everybody would be treated as individuals. They just realized, okay, we just need to cozy up to leaders. We need to make sure that the person that
Right.
has the power is going to like us. Very much identity
Right.
politics leaning into it. We don't really care about these wider issues at play like liberalism because we just don't we don't have the power or the bandwidth to think about that. I bring this up because people that have listened to this podcast have obviously known in my head, I've sort of, I can debate myself at this point whether or not I think Trump has been good or bad for Jews, good or bad for
Right.
Israel, has helped anti-Semitism, has hurt, any and all of these things. And I think the pro-Trump position, which part of me shares, part of me rejects, is going back to that vertical alliance. Is essentially giving up on liberalism
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
figure it out and saying, yes, he is the king, he is the strongman, he is the Shah, and let's just cozy up to him. And, okay, when he goes and there's another president, we do the same playbook again with that and stop
Right.
worrying about trying to, usher in, greater liberalism. The counterposition is, of course, in the vertical alliance when the king or the czar or whatever doesn't like Jews, things get very, very bad. But I'm curious how you're thinking about this in terms of, our
Right.
political moment.
Oh, your questions are fantastic. You're good at this. I do want to steer clear of the politics. Trump is divisive, and partly we live in such a polarized environment now, and neither side can hear the other side, but either both sides look at the other side as, traitors or not true Americans, and we have this kind of political derangement such that I grew up in an environment and I was a registered Democrat for many years. I had to leave the party 2 or 3 years ago because the party, in my view, is just so unbelievably hostile to Israel and ultimately hostile to Jews. So I'm an independent now, just to share that bit. But so I understand the people who are not fans of Donald Trump in general. There's many things one could easily not love about him, especially if you're coming from this sort of left perspective. But what bothers me, I suppose, is the inability to recognize a good thing your political opponent might occasionally do too, right? Like, and maybe it's because I'm a philosopher and as a professor, I'm trained in nuance and I have a lot of trouble arguing for any position because I'm always aware of, first of all, the 10 ways I need to qualify what I'm saying and then the 10 objections to it. And they also have merit too, right? It's like, I thrive on nuance. I love nuance, and when I'm at least writing, I try to be good at it, etc. But there's just so if you're nuanced, you can say, well, here's an individual, and he's complicated, and there's things I like about him, and things I don't like about him, and there's decisions I approve of, and other decisions I don't like. But we're somehow, as a collective, we're not able to think that way, and so we're in a situation where, to me, it was pretty clear if we're just talking about policy towards Israel that Trump was a much better candidate than Harris. In my view, everything Harris was doing was pointing down a very, very dark road for Israel. And if it's dark for Israel, it will be dark for the diaspora Jews. I do believe that. So on that one issue alone, to me, Trump was clearly the better candidate. That said, many of the things he's done, I think, are good if you care about Israel, but there's a lot of stuff that's also questionable that he's doing. So I don't really know how to answer the question. I think many Jews are wise enough to say, especially in a democracy where the leader's only around, in this case, for one term, we presume 4 years, like, you cozy up to him to a certain degree, but you don't want to do it to the point where you're now pissed off the next leader who comes in 4 years, right? So, a lot of Jews just want to keep their heads down and they want to believe that it doesn't really matter if the United States is allied with Israel, Israel's strong enough, or, and some Jews think, all right, obviously, if Israel is destroyed, that will be mass death and ethnic cleansing. I don't see any other, they're not going to go down easily, right? But you could still believe in the diaspora, like, well, that's their problem. I mean, that seems really cold and cruel. So I don't know if I want to say any diaspora Jews think that way, but I guess I worry that they do, that they say it doesn't affect me here what happens in Israel. And if the last couple of years since October 7th have made anything clear, it's that what's going on with Israel does affect you here. You might make a distinction between Israelis and you as an American Jew, let's say, but the large majority of haters don't make that distinction, and they will go after you because you're a Jew, and a Jew is associated with Israel in their mind. And we've even seen cases, some of the anti-Zionist Jews, like just, Peter Beinart's most recent humiliation, if you followed that case a month or two ago, right?
I
Like,
actually talked about that with Adam Louis Klein
yeah,
a
right.
couple of weeks ago.
Interesting case. we more cynical Zionist Jews tend to say, like, you anti-Zionist Jews, you're trying to save your skin by appeasing the enemy, but trust us, when they're done with us, they're coming after you. So we sort of look at the moments like Peter Beinart, who's a very active anti-Zionist Jew, basically made the horrific mistake of like going to Israel and speaking to Israelis, and a lot of the other
and
anti-Zionists
and not only,
condemned
I
him.
mean, just for people that haven't listened to the podcast or heard about the drama, he wasn't going. I mean, he was going to Israel, but it was to criticize Israelis,
No,
at behest of,
he
a
wanted to
big
speak
university.
truth to power, and
Yeah, yeah.
good for him. Why not, right? Like, but he was roundly condemned and made fun of and humiliated by his anti-Zionist allies. And we on the other side look at that as saying, they're only going to like you as long as you're supporting them. But as soon as they achieve their goal, they have no reason to like you anymore because ultimately, deep down, what anti-Zionism is hostility towards and support for attacks on the Jews. Ultimately, that's what it is. It doesn't matter what distinctions you make, what language you use. If you want to destroy the Jewish state, which is what anti-Zionism is today, the only way that's going to happen is going to be by the murder and ethnic cleansing of many millions of Jews in Israel. And it's going to involve, as we've already seen hints of, significant attacks on Jews everywhere, right? So,
I would just say my tension, going back to what you said before about, obviously, even if American Jews don't think they have to worry about what Israelis are experiencing,
right,
my tension's actually been the exact opposite. This will be the last thing that I say, and I'm planning on doing a couple of different podcasts with various people about this one question. But for me, and I think a lot of American Jews that have been, shocked by what they've seen, maybe not surprised, but a little bit jolted over the last couple of years, is my relationship to American politics and political values, and even more what I would consider, universal moral concerns,
right,
is thinking of my civic duty as an American of saying things like, even if I know that maybe it'll put me personally in a higher tax bracket, these policies I do think, are universally better for all of these people. Therefore, I'm willing
right,
to sacrifice maybe, an extra couple hundred or $1,000 a year in tax benefits because to enable social policies,
right,
across different ethnic groups and genders that I like better. I've
right,
moved to a position, and I'm slowly moving, and this is sort of the question of, caught in the middle here, where almost, again, going back to that vertical alliance worldview, which is essentially my job as a Jew here is not to worry about broader universalistic concerns. When Jews are
right,
under attack, I have a tribalistic need to protect not just the Jewish
right,
people, but my family. I'm going to vote for whatever policies directly benefit myself and my community. If
right,
that means that I am accidentally, or, if there's collateral damage of, say, abortion rights, or what ICE is doing or things like that, I'm not happy about that. But essentially,
right,
I'm going to care about my family first. And I feel very torn. I'm not saying I've completely gone down
right,
that
right, right.
route, but in
Right.
terms of, the conversations I'm having with friends of mine, I really do feel pulled by those opposite impulses.
Well, let me make that a little easier for you to go the route that you're clearly uncomfortable going, right? And the reason you're uncomfortable going is you're like a really good person and you actually care about all of humanity and you care about marginalized people and like you want to help everybody, right? So that's beautiful. That's like what a human being you are, right? And how wonderful that is. But you can frame it this way, which is that, first of all, I've used this slogan in essays I was writing actually in the run up to the election, which is put your own mask on first, right? Like the in the airline when they say, should the oxygen masks fall down and you need to you're with someone who needs assistance, like your child, put your own mask on first. Why? Because the understanding is that if you spend time trying to get it on the other person, you're probably going to die and you'll be no use to anybody, right? You're not going to be of use to the person you want to help if you are harmed. And so to me, that's a generally fair strategy in life, and that's the strategy you're sort of talking about. But then second, it's not the way when it's framed in the evil way, it's framed as like, I'm in it for me and I want to get benefits and I don't care about anybody else. Like I want to get to the top, like, you know, self-interested capitalism. I want to have the most money. But that's not what's going on here at all, as you put it very nicely, right? When I feel like my people are under attack, what I think most Jews, at least in my circles, intellectual circles now, ideological circles better. What most Jews want is actually just security and freedom. Like We would love to be left alone to pursue, for example, universal moral concerns like the ones you just mentioned. But right now, when we're under attack, it's not that we want something for ourselves, like a special privilege or a benefit that other people don't have. What we're really demanding is the same safety and security that all people should have. It's actually the put your own mask first on isn't again so that I become rich and powerful. It's just so that I can live the way other people can live, right? It's not doesn't have that selfish tinge to it, which is the thing that makes it sort of feel tainted a little bit. And I do believe, a society. This is a sort of truism, right? The society that goes after its Jews has a lot of bigger and deeper problems, and it's actually by restoring or reinstating the not the power and position of Jews, but the freedom and security of Jews in our society. That is what's necessary to ultimately heal the society. I do believe that, and that's why at this particular juncture, I am fighting not for special benefits or privileges for Jews, but for the freedom and security of Jews to pursue their course of life, their choice of life, whether it's a dedicated Jewish life or a more universal morality life, whatever. So to that end, this institute, right? The academy has really been conquered by, talk about conspiracy conquering subjugation, by this anti-Zionist ideology. It's just all the major campuses, so many departments and disciplines, and certainly the loudest, most vocal professors are anti-Zionists. And it's all under the banner of anti-racism. So any little pushback, you're a racist if you're pushing back against it. It is time to establish a beachhead on a university and reclaim this territory. But the way to do it isn't we talk about and promote Zionism. We've been doing that for years. It's not working just as an empirical matter. What we need to do is show that this anti-Zionism that is all the rage that dominates the academy and therefore spills out beyond the quad and into the streets and into our governments, New York City, for example, that this anti-Zionism is not what it says it is. It is not somehow a virtuous moral movement. It is actually has deep roots in annihilationist conspiratorial Jew hatred. We need to expose that. So that's what I'm aiming to do. And if people are interested, there's a website, Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism, ICSA, but I think it's ixaz.org, or follow me, Andrew.Pessin, andrewpessin.com, my website, you'll find me. Also, there's a Substack, ICSA, icsa.substack.org, and you can find out more about this institute. And if you're a particular scholar and you want to get involved in this, please reach out to me. I already have a roster of like 70 scholars who've expressed interest, and I've barely begun recruiting. So I know there's interest, I know there's a need, and the time is now.
Awesome. Well, Andrew Pessin, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.